Hello. Good afternoon. Children. Okay. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on Indigenous land. I am fairly ignorant still after 6 years of living in Binghamton of how Indigenous people lived here and still live, but I believe that is Onondaga Nation land. So I want to acknowledge their ownership of where we are. And I'm also going to start by explaining the objectives of my talk today. This presentation is an experiment. I recently began working with my interviews and data that I've collected for my dissertation research. And so in this presentation, I am experimenting with connecting my preliminary findings with my thesis, my working thesis, I guess, and making the case for a method that I call, or I will refer to as embedding world historically. So as our friend Dale Tromich might say, I'm moving between the abstract and the concrete and working through that process. That's the process that I'm at in my dissertation research. Okay, so nationalization, expropriation. In the US, you might call it eminent domain. Governments taking ownership of private companies has a certain appeal to today's anti-capitalists, as you see here. Reacting against decades of privatization, could nationalization offer a way of democratizing economic decisions? Could nationalization be a tool for economic transformation that fights rather than inflames catastrophic climate change? This is what motivates my research, but rather than studying it theoretically, my research looks at the history of nationalizations to explain why some governments nationalize and others do not. I argue that the small South American country of Suriname presents a puzzle for existing answers to this question. In the 1970s, you may have heard, it was a time of widespread movements for national sovereignty over raw materials. Nationalization then was a prominent strategy of governments that sought to exercise what the UN called permanent sovereignty over natural resources. The best known such case would be that of petroleum. Almost every major oil exporter nationalized at least part of the industry by 1976. The governments of Jamaica, Guyana, Guinea, and Ghana all took at least a majority stake in companies that mine bauxite, the raw material of aluminium, in this decade. Yet Suriname, bordered by Guyana, as well as Brazil and French Guyana, as you can see there, did not. Suriname's was the only government of the major bauxite exporting countries of the global south that did not nationalize bauxite mining. If you aren't familiar with Suriname, you can see a little of its geographic location on this map. It is on the northern coast of South America, and it's a former Dutch colony that became independent in 1975. For several decades, Suriname had already by that point been heavily dependent on commodity exports. We might assume that such a country would be among the first to take advantage of the conditions of the 1970s that enabled nationalizations in so many other global south or developing countries. In the literature, peripheral countries, we might say, in these haloed walls. In the literature explaining why some governments nationalize, dominant approaches are typically written from the perspective of investors. They focus on strategies that investors can use to protect against any government action that reduces the profitability of their investment. And as you might expect, they tend to assume that state actors in resource-rich nations like Suriname would always want to maximize their control over these resources. Of course, that can't explain why a country like Suriname would not nationalize. Theories of relations between states and multinationals would also expect that Suriname was in a relatively strong position from which a nationalized firm could participate in global markets, because from the late 1950s, it was the only producer in the global south with an integrated aluminum industry. I propose that we can an approach that can explain why Suriname did not nationalize by embedding national politics world historically. My approach builds on Kaup-Gellert's theory of cycles of resource nationalism. They argue that national politics in what they call resource peripheries is shaped by long-term cyclical trends in the capitalist world economy. They examine the relations between resource peripheries and, let's say, hegemonic states or states that are competing for hegemony to explain why resource nationalism might appear to be to happen in waves. For this approach, politicians' efforts to capture greater benefits from resource extraction, such as through nationalization, are ultimately part of the history of capitalist spatial expansion. And those governments are successful when intensified competition for hegemony creates opportunities for resource nationalism. And moreover, those opportunities, those moments of intensified competition shape the character of resource nationalism. So they argue that nationalization was characteristic of resource nationalism between the 1930s and the 1970s, which is quite a long period, but nevertheless, because they see it as a reaction against the British-led system of accumulation through colonization. I argue that to explain the puzzle of Suriname's non-nationalization, we need to go one step further, not just looking at how states are related to each other in the world economy, as resource peripheries and potential hegemons, but examine how the national politics of a country such as Suriname that is constituted as a resource periphery, how its national politics are itself embedded world historically, formed through and forming the relations that make up the capitalist world economy. So in today's presentation, I am drawing on some interviews that I did in Suriname over the winter and the summer to show how Suriname's national politics was a part of late Dutch colonial power. So I argue that Suriname's national politics were both shaped by, and I don't say enough about this in this presentation, but I would argue they also shaped late Dutch colonial power as well. So for Kaup-Gellert's theory, the period of upswing in demands for resource nationalism takes the form of nationalization because it responds to this earlier mode of territorial conquest as the means of capitalist expansion. As I've said, Dutch colonial control of Suriname did not spur nationalization. And many who look at the Dutch role in the development of bauxite mining in Suriname and of Suriname's late independence portray the Netherlands as willingly giving up its colonial power. In a, we could say, maybe foundational text or one of the few texts to look at the history of bauxite mining in Suriname, this guy called Lamour, he titled his book, The American Takeover. And that really captures a view of this history, which is that the Dutch government sat by and allowed the US multinational Alcoa to build a monopoly over Suriname's bauxite reserves. America took over, and this is a picture of one of the some of the remains, I guess, from America's presence in Suriname during World War II, which, so going to try to not add in too much random context, but in aluminum became such a vital strategic mineral in World War II because they started to use it to make planes, weapons, and something like 60% or maybe more of the aluminum used in the US contribution to the war effort in World War II came from Suriname's bauxite, was made from Suriname's bauxite. So the US set up a military presence in Suriname, and all the good roads that exist in Suriname can basically, and all the infrastructure that is any good at all can mostly be traced back to that US presence. And similar to that, we have a theory of Suriname's form of nationalist politics that is well captured by an article by this guy called Bob Moore. I don't know why I'm calling them these guys. My old mate Bob Moore, whose article was titled Decolonization by Default. And you know, both of these arguments, American takeover, decolonization by default, I think tell us some of the answer here. These national stories that focus on, from the Suriname context, why did things happen the way they did? According to this theory, this explanation, Suriname became independent in 1975 almost by accident. It was really driven by things that were happening elsewhere in the Dutch Empire, more than demands from within Suriname. So this is a picture of from Curacao, one of the islands in the Caribbean, also still part of the Netherlands. And this was in 1969, there was a big strike and protest against that. I won't go into the details, but anyway, supposedly the story goes that the Dutch were so embarrassed by being essentially forced to send their army to shut down the protests, that when the opportunity came a few years later to get rid of the embarrassing colony of Suriname, they jumped at it. So there is something to that, but I argue that if we embed Suriname's national politics, then we can see late Dutch colonialism as an active force, facilitating American capitalism in Suriname, but by remaking national politics. So that is my goal here. Right. Okay, so hang on a second, I feel like I'm jumping. Okay. Sorry. Okay, during my time in Suriname, the importance of Alcoa, the US company, was obvious. There are faded signs everywhere revealing the company's sponsorship of protected environmental areas and tourist infrastructure. Almost everyone I met told me about a relative of theirs who had worked for Alcoa's local subsidiary, Suralco. Many recounted stories from their childhoods spent enjoying the facilities of the company town at its premier mine site, Mungo. Tour guides would point out the decommissioned structures that comprised Suralco's refining and smelting complex at Paranam. The centerpiece of a project that I argue can help us explain the lack of nationalization, called the Broco Pondo project, is this hydropower, is this dam. Hard to imagine that this is a source of hydroelectricity, but on one, it's got the turbines on one end, on another end, it's a popular tourist attraction. And there are resorts, such as they are, built into its northern boundary. There's I don't have time to go into this, but it is quite a horrific story, really, as with the construction of many dams. When this was constructed, the villages of many maroon villages were flooded, and it's kind of eerie the way that they left some of these trees in place so you can still get a sense of what used to be there. Anyway, and yeah, there are ongoing consequences from that today, of course. So how this connects to my thesis is that I argue Suriname's lack of bauxite nationalisation should be traced to this earlier industrialisation deal with the US company Alcoa. This deal, as I said, is responsible for this dam and for that complex at Paranam. 17 years before Suriname's independence, so we're back in 1958 now, Suriname and Alcoa signed this agreement, which I would argue is surprising, whereby Alcoa committed to manufacture aluminium in the country. And I mentioned at the beginning that Suriname was the only bauxite producer in the global south to have an integrated aluminium industry. That's because of this deal. And that's incredibly unusual. But it's not just that was an unusual deal. I argue that the politics of that deal also matter for explaining how it came to mitigate against later nationalisation. I'll briefly overview this, which is leaders of two ethnically identified opposition parties played a key role in developing the deal. They had ties to bauxite workers' unions, and they later formed a coalition government that lasted almost a decade and is widely recognised as a sort of foundational, institutional moment in Suriname's history. And I argue that this deal incorporated bauxite workers into a cross-ethnic political alliance, and as part of that led to things such as collective bargaining for bauxite workers and others, and demobilized both workers but also a segment of what in Suriname they would call a Creole elite, who might have had an interest in nationalisation. I won't be able to explain all of this in this talk, but just to give you a taste of where I'm trying to go with my overall thesis. And I argue that this kind of a deal was possible because of Alcoa's because of changes in the global commodity chain, the global aluminium commodity chain, which are not just happening, but that are being constituted by these processes I described. And also because of the structure of Dutch colonial control and its associated racial discourses and the way they were institutionalized in Suriname's politics of national autonomy. So that's where I approached this when I went to Suriname. And my interviews support the idea that Alcoa was an ally in this project of national autonomy. I interviewed a former Minister of Labour who was very critical of Alcoa. His narrative about the history of the industry in Suriname saw forward-thinking local policymakers on one side, and then on the other side, a Dutch government that lacked any vision for Suriname's development, while passively supporting Alcoa's extraction of the country's natural resources, similar to the American takeover model. I argue that underlying his narrative is an ideal of national autonomy that's built on an alliance between those local policymakers and Alcoa, even though he was critical of Alcoa. He talked about there being a history of Surinamese efforts to improve the terms of the exploitation of their minerals, which had their basis in a vision for mining as, he said, our own line of development. He argued that mining, led by Alcoa, he didn't say that, but he never challenged that it would be led by Alcoa, appealed to Suriname's planners as a way to break with the model of agricultural development promoted by the Netherlands, which reproduced dependency. So the major obstacle success for him was not so much Alcoa, although he was certainly critical of them, but the fact that Suriname's hand was weakened by lack of support from the Netherlands. I argue also that the perceived contrast between, I think I forgot to mention that Alcoa was not the only company operating in bauxite mining in Suriname. So it's easy to forget this because it's generally not mentioned. However, there was a second company, the Dutch mining company, Billiton. And I would argue that even though Billiton had a relatively minor role in the industry, its presence there and its minor role was essential to supporting the social license to operate, in today's jargon, of Alcoa, which was originally, and these are milk bottles from Alcoa's subsidiary that was originally called the Suriname Bauxite Maatschappij, and then later renamed Suralco, part of Alcoa. So Suralco had a significant social basis, like social license to operate here, and I would argue that Billiton played a key role there. So that came up a lot in my interviews, to the extent that, and not so much people talking about Billiton, but that Alcoa had a social license. So, for example, a Labour leader I spoke to described cultural differences between the two companies' management styles, talking about Alcoa's more business-like approach. Someone else talked about Americans making a straight deal, the implication being that Billiton's style of negotiation was in line with its ties with the Netherlands and a colonial relation. It's true that Billiton only acquired bauxite mining rights decades after Alcoa's takeover, when the economic and military significance of aluminium were already established, first mover advantage lost. But it appeared from my interviews that it's at least possible that Billiton had a more central but under-recognised and perhaps deliberately downplayed role in Suriname's bauxite industry. So this is very tentative in relation to my findings right now, but I think it could support what I've been suggesting, which is, so a former manager of Suralco insisted to me that it was really Billiton that drove these industrialization components of the deal that I talked about, that without Billiton, that Suralco had no immediate plan to actually follow through. And it was only because Billiton saw an opportunity to take advantage of tariff-free trade within the European Economic Community that led to what's called a tolling agreement, I guess. Just an agreement, I feel like, is sufficient language. I don't know why we have to have special language anyway, between the two companies, whereby Suralco, Alcoa, operated the smelting and refining, but Billiton was able to export the, not aluminum, but alumina, the middle sort of output to Europe. And yeah, so the way that this narrative that I heard from this ex-Suralco manager also confirmed in a few different ways that Billiton could be seen as representative of colonial rule. He viewed the attitude of Surinamese policymakers to Billiton as exemplifying a habitual opposition to foreign investment in general. And he recounted a comment by a then minister that it was a good thing when Billiton closed its local operations because the Dutch were finally leaving them alone. So from these very preliminary findings, I think that we can argue that the minor position taken by the Dutch mining company Billiton in Suriname's bauxite industry facilitated the rise of a nationalist politics that allied with the US mining company Alcoa. The cross-ethnic political alliance that held majorities, as I mentioned before, in Suriname's colonial legislature in the late 1950s, 1960s, was able to present this deal that I spoke about, the Brokopondo deal, its industrialization components, as a successful negotiation on behalf of the Surinamese national interest towards national autonomy with Alcoa as partner. As the only other bauxite mining company operating in Suriname, Billiton's close association with colonialism contributed to Alcoa's social license. So through this, we can see that Dutch colonialism was not merely an absence, but an active presence through this relatively minor role of Billiton, which had an important contribution to making way. So basically through this, the Dutch colonialism made way for US corporate interests. So as I keep saying, this is very preliminary, but I hope that what I've attempted to do is give some flavor of how a method of embedding world historically can change our understanding, improve our understanding of why some governments would nationalize and integrate national politics into our stories of world economic restructuring.